You're going to be looking out for as this trial gets underway?
Well, this is all about the dangerous distortion of truth, because those rioters who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, that didn't happen in a vacuum. They were fed lies. They were fed disinformation. So the disinformation about Dominion is what is on trial right now. Fox is being held accountable in a way it never has been before. And what I'm watching are the dollar figures, the dollar totals here.
You're going to be looking out for as this trial gets
underway. Can we appreciate the irony of Brian Stetler lecturing on Fox News disinformation? We're not going to get into that in the details of that tonight. I'll talk about that tomorrow. The details of the $787.5 million settlement between Fox and Dominion. It's just an apropos intro to today's stream, because today we have Bret Weinstein. And I've checked, it's Weinstein, not Weinstein, although I suspect, he gets both. Bret Weinstein, who, if you go read his Wikipedia page, you'd think he is a nobody who was just coming up with some ideas off the street and, shouting them into the air with no credentials, no nothing. Wikipedia has the audacity to accuse Bret Weinstein of COVID disinformation. It's an amazing world that the people who don't know, the people who actually are probably the ones who should stay in their lane, if anyone is to stay in their lane, although I don't like that idea, that concept whatsoever, but the ones telling the Bret Weinsteins of the world, you're just an evolutionary biologist. What do you know? Stay in your lane. You're not a, what's the word for the thing, the people who study diseases? I forgot the word now. I'm an idiot. You know the word I'm thinking about. You're not one of those. And if you happen to be one of those, you're a quack if you don't toe the official narrative. Disinformation, misinformation, and the abuse of those terms has been something that Bret Weinstein has been the victim of in real time in a way that I suspect he could never have foreseen. Epidemiologist, thank you very much, Nathan Danner. So we've got Bret Weinstein on tonight. For obvious reasons, we're not staying very long on YouTube, because I'd actually like to have a discussion. I'd like to ask some of the neurotic questions that have been lingering in the back of my mind for the last 2 years. And we can't have those questions on YouTube. I was listening to some podcasts with Bret on Spotify, and I happened to see a number of his Dark Horse podcasts just graffitied with, this might contain COVID. And find the latest on COVID information. We live in a world where unlicensed social media tech people are telling licensed doctors how to practice. They're telling evolutionary biologists what to think and what's the truth and what's not the truth of the day, which happens to change from one year to the next. It's a wild, wild world. Okay, all that to say, we've got Bret. I'm going to bring him in now because I said I'd do 3 minutes to let everyone trickle in. We're going to head over to Rumble much sooner than later, but we're going to do the standard 30,000-foot overview, get to know Bret, how he got to be where he is, and then his rude entry. Is it the rude entry or rough entry into the world of identity politics and social media smearing campaigns? Bret, I see you. I'm bringing you in 3, 2, 1. Bret, sir, how goes the battle?
Not bad. I have my go bag packed for when we leave YouTube and head on over to Rumble, so I'm ready for that. You just tell me when we're moving, and it's going pretty well. How are you?
I'm other than the witnessing a world go crazy and my standard neuroses, I've been better, but I've been worse, and we have no choice but to keep plugging along. Bret, for anybody who's watching who doesn't know who you are, the 30,000-foot overview as to who you are now, but then I'll have my standard intro questions as to like childhood. I know a lot of these answers because we've met in person, and it's not going to be my first time hearing the answers, but I'm going to look surprised when you answer them anyhow. Who are you, for those who don't know?
I am an evolutionary biologist. I studied evolutionary biology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor under Dick Alexander, who's one of the great evolutionary biologists of the 20th century. I did my undergraduate at UCSC under Robert Trivers, another one of the greats. So in any case, I have been in the thick of it from the point of view of evolutionary science. I taught for 14 years at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. That came to an abrupt and rather spectacular end when at 9:30 in the morning on May 23rd, 2017, 50 students that I'd never met before streamed into my classroom and accused me of racism and demanded my firing or resignation. They foolishly filmed everything they did as the college descended into riots and anarchy, that is literal anarchy. They uploaded it to Facebook. Somebody moved it over to YouTube. The incident became quite famous. Of course, nobody ever found any evidence of racism because I'm not a racist. And in any case, that's how I came to public attention. Since then, I have been doing the Dark Horse podcast every Saturday. My wife, Heather Hying, another evolutionary biologist, and I do a live stream. Those live streams have focused quite a bit on COVID, which has gotten us into quite a bit of hot water, as I think you know. We wrote a book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, which became a New York Times bestseller almost instantly. So anyway, that's the short version.
Well, we're going to get into some of that stuff in much greater detail, specifically the Evergreen incident. But back it all the way up to the beginning. I like to ask these questions just to get the context. How many generations American are you? Where were you born, raised? What was your childhood like in the States? I'm going to bring in Robert right now just so we can get this hold on like this. There we go.
My grandparents on my father's side were immigrants, and my great-grandparents on my mother's side were immigrants. I grew up in Los Angeles, California. I am not, however, crazy, but nonetheless, I did spend time there. I've actually come to appreciate the place a great deal more since leaving. I didn't much like it when I was there as a young person. For one thing, it made it very hard to learn what order the seasons came in, but I got that wired now. What else did you ask me?
Oh, what did your parents do? How many siblings? And where were you raised in California?
So I grew up not far from the tar pits in Los Angeles, about a mile from the tar pits. My father is a lawyer. He actually did antitrust law under Bobby Kennedy Sr. In the Justice Department many decades ago. My mother is a psychologist, now retired. I am having trouble keeping track of all of the questions you've asked.
And your brother also famous, Eric. Are there other siblings that we may be less familiar with?
There are no other siblings that I'm aware of. So only Eric. Yes, Eric is well known. He is the originator of the idea of the intellectual dark web. He coined that term. And anyway, people will be familiar with him. He is he would say a mathematician. I think people would probably understand him better as a mathematical physicist. He's interested in theories of everything, etc. Yeah, that's it. No other siblings.
What was it like watching you and your brother talk? Sometimes reminds me of when I'm talking to my brother. He's he does metaphysics and philosophy, and he'll be describing something to me, and he assumes I know what he's talking about, and sometimes I have absolutely no clue. And it seems like you guys at times have your own language when you're talking to each other. Was it that way when you were growing up, or is that something that became more of a phenomenon as adults?
Well, I'm on both sides of that, because on the one hand, we do have a language that makes it very efficient for us to communicate about technical matters. I also have a language with Heather, and there's a lot of overlap between my language with Heather and my language with Eric. There are just certain terms of art that, for example, if we talk about the trade-off between hill climbing and valley crossing, that may sound bizarre and mysterious to most people, but it's a very efficient way of describing an evolutionary process. So anyway, it was like that. On the other hand, there is a place in Eric's area of specialty where he crosses out of that which I understand, and I become a spectator like everybody else. And maybe I have a little bit of insight because, sciences work the same way, and math, if it isn't exactly a science, is certainly an adjacent style of thought. But there is definitely an area that Eric understands well that I really don't.
Bret, I mean, we're going to get into the discussion of COVID on Rumble, but so people can I don't know, place you in terms of credentials and in terms of your expertise? What goes into getting, I mean, I presume, I don't know what level of degree, but evolutionary biology, it's a science, it's not an art. I mean, what goes into that study, and how many years did you do it for?
Well, we should probably come back to the question of art and science, because really this is one of these things that scientists misportray, I think, out of a kind of insecurity. And so, yes, evolutionary biology is definitely a science, but there's an aspect of it that if you're going to be any good, it's an art. So we can come back to that. But in any case, I studied, my field work involved bats of all things. I was studying tent making bats in Costa Rica and Panama. These are animals that modify understory leaves into roost structures, and I did a number of things with them. I radio tracked them to test a hypothesis about why this behavior had evolved multiple times. I also innovated some technology that allowed me to, I believe I am the only person who has ever watched a bat make a tent, which I was able to do by using infrared LEDs that I bought. These are the kind of LEDs that are used in television remote controls. And I rigged up basically a light block that I put under a tent that I knew was about to be modified, because I could see the initial signs. And I sat there for several nights in the dark using a bank surveillance camera and this infrared illuminator to watch this animal construct a tent. So anyway, it solved a problem that hadn't been solved before. Now, of course, that technology is readily available. You buy a camera, it may well have night shot on it, but that wasn't the case back then. I had to rig the system to do it. My dissertation ended up focusing on evolutionary trade-offs. So what I argued in my dissertation was that there's actually a set of rules that governs the trade-offs between different desirable characteristics that biological organisms have, and that all of the major problems that we can't solve in evolutionary biology can be solved if you understand the way trade-offs function. And so anyway, I laid out that argument, and I wrote several chapters giving examples of difficult problems that were solvable if you took this particular approach.
Now, as a general matter, what inspires, like, are you 8 years old and you think, I'd like to go study bats, and especially the bats that make tents? What leads you to that path?
Well, the answer is kind of funny, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but it's pretty close. My grandmother used to read to me from a book called Animals Do the Strangest Things. And I only remember one of the animals in that book. In fact, I haven't seen it since I was probably 5 years old. But the pangolin was described in this book, and I thought that is so fascinating. And in any case, there's a kind of a game that I started playing. I didn't even realize I was doing it when I was very young, but looking at organisms and trying to understand why they were structured in the way that they were. And that was fun for me. And then when I got to high school and then college, and I realized that there was actually a field of study that took this question and made it into a rigorous exploration where you could not only hypothesize an answer to why a creature was structured in a particular way or why it was behaving in a particular way, but you could test those answers against each other, and you could figure out which ones had merit and which ones didn't. And that was tantalizing. Now, when I went to graduate school, I vowed to myself that I wasn't going to study evolutionary biology, because I thought, this was something I had already explored quite a bit, and I thought it would be better for me if I approached what I thought was a harder biological field, something like neurobiology or cellular biology. And when I went into those labs, in my first year of graduate school, in order to figure out whether I wanted to study one field or another, I found the thinking that I saw there kind of feeble. It was surprising to me, because I had assumed that it would be even more hard-headed and rigorous. And what it was more technical. but it was not more rigorous. And so I ended up finding the evolutionary biologists who turned out to be the strongest thinkers in the department at Michigan. And, from there, it was just a question of what particular organisms I wanted to study and in what way. You mentioned earlier you didn't know what level of degree. I do have a doctorate in biology. My specialty was evolution. Heather, my wife, also has a doctorate. She studied poison frogs in Madagascar. So anyway, that's sort of the gist.
Okay, that's amazing, and all of this is going to loop back in when we start talking about COVID itself. But this will be the last subject that we talk about on YouTube. But I want it to be everyone to hear about this before we go over to Rumble. And I say this non-judgmentally, but up until the Evergreen incident, you had a pretty routine professor life at university. I mean, nothing. You were not on the map of the interwebs, or you hadn't had any controversies up until the Evergreen incident.
That is not the case, and this is why you asked the question, is that it doesn't have a straightforward answer. The fact is, I polarized my department in graduate school, and I had also had an incident in college that few are aware of, but definitely foreshadowed what happened to me at Evergreen. So in college, as a freshman, I was not rushing a fraternity. It wasn't my style. I was at the University of Pennsylvania, but my next door neighbor in the dorm and a good friend of mine was rushing a fraternity, and one day he talked me into going to a Rush event, which I was reluctant to go to, but he correctly pointed out that I didn't have anything to do, and I was probably not going to get around to doing the reading that I was supposed to be doing, so why not? I went. There was an incident. I brought the incident to the attention of the paper, thinking that it was important, and there was a scandal that broke out after this, and it polarized the campus. So there is an argument to be made that one of the things I do is polarize places, and my feeling is that's not a bad thing if they polarize correctly. In other words, if the people who are actually honorable end up respecting you, then it doesn't matter that you create a whole lot of enemies. That's more or less, it means that you're having an effect.
What was the nature of the incident? Not to get into details, just an idea.
The ZBT fraternity had hired, so Penn is in a depressed Black neighborhood in Philadelphia, and the fraternity in question was a wealthy Jewish fraternity that had hired Black prostitutes from the neighborhood, and it had done so through a guy who appeared to be their pimp, who they brought on stage to introduce these women, and then they enacted a mock rape of these women in which the Rushes of the fraternity had to participate. It was a hazing event from the point of view of the Rushes, but it was also a pretty despicable display and pretty insensitive to the neighborhood in which the college existed. And I thought that the fact that these organizations were privileged, had their own judicial system, for example, on the campus, had the nicest real estate that was available on the campus, and were behaving in this way that reflected badly on the rest of the school, would be significant to people. When I went to the paper, and again, this foreshadowed a lot of what I saw after the Evergreen incident and a lot of what happened over COVID, but the press botched it. The story they published ultimately, because the fraternity members were unwilling to comment, and they told many different stories about what had happened that night, including that there was a chess tournament and other lies. But the paper reported that several fraternities had hired strippers, and then they used quotes from me that were not about stripping at all. They were about this mock rape that had taken place. And so in the context of a story about fraternities hiring women to take off their clothes, my comments seemed overheated, and it caused me to be mocked. And so I insisted that they let me write an editorial in which I explained what I was actually commenting on. And then at that point, I became, I guess, public enemy number one for the first time in my life, because I was revealing a deep, dark secret of the fraternity system, which ultimately got that fraternity banned from campus for a year. But in any case, so that is a story in my past. No, it is not the case that I was, that my life was uneventful until Evergreen. It was eventful, but yes, the events have changed scale.
Now, in terms of the grad school, my recollection is that this concerns what you found about the efficacy of certain lab testing techniques and whatnot. I found that actually even more disturbing in many respects than some of the other things that you've exposed. Can you explain that for folks?
Yeah, there's a question about how deep we should go, because we could obviously spend hours fully exploring the topic, but I'll give you the view from 30,000 feet. So I wasn't really looking to find anything about drug safety testing. In fact, when I started the project, I didn't have any intent to go anywhere medical at all. I was really just trying to answer an evolutionary question that I found interesting and about which I had a sudden flash of insight. The question was, why do creatures like us grow feeble and inefficient with age? The technical term for it is senescence. The common parlance term would be aging. But I was interested in why we senesce. And that is a question that has had a proper theoretical answer since 1947, when George Williams wrote a paper explaining the basic underlying trade-off, but had never had a practical example found. And one day I was sitting in a seminar, and a student who didn't really know anything about evolution, a guy who decided to try out the seminar in some spare time he had from the cancer lab he was working in, gave a talk about cancer. And I realized that there were two different groups of people, one studying aging or senescence, the other studying cancer, who had become focused on the exact same mechanism, but they saw it in exactly inverse terms. So the people who were studying aging looked at something called telomeres, and they thought that the fact that telomeres, which are repetitive gene sequences at the ends of chromosomes, the fact that those sequences were limited and therefore limited the number of times cells could reproduce, that was probably a curable cause for senescence. In other words, they wanted to remove the limits on the telomeres. And the other group was studying cancer, and they had discovered that those limits had been lost every time they looked into a cancer. And so they wanted to institute better limits. And each group thought that they were about to extend human longevity by messing with telomeres, but they clearly weren't spotting the other half of the puzzle, which suggested that actually the answer I mentioned from 1947, George Williams, was correct, that there was a trade-off, and that in fact, the reason that we don't unlimit our telomeres and have infinite cellular replacement is that we would be almost immediately overrun by tumors, right? So we have an elegant system that causes almost all of the tumors that we would otherwise get to arrest themselves, and you're never aware of them. But the cost is you can't repair your tissues indefinitely throughout life. So that's the question I was studying. But as clean a story as that is, there was one huge obstacle, which was that mice were understood to have extremely long telomeres, much longer than human telomeres, and yet they had very short lives, which was presumed to falsify any such model. And I looked at this and I thought, there are too many places where this model that places tissue repair and tumor suppression as opposing forces in a trade-off, there are too many questions that would be solved if it were true. And there was only one piece of evidence that suggested it was false. Maybe there's something wrong with that piece of evidence. And it's when I went looking for what might be wrong with the idea that mice have very long telomeres and short lives, that's where I tripped over it. And by it, I mean I went from an area that was more or less just of academic interest or scientific interest. And I moved accidentally into an area where there was a huge amount of money at stake. That's the point at which science went insane around me, and I grew up. I learned the lesson about what happens to science in the context of money, and it ain't pretty. So to your question, Robert, it turned out that the problem that I had identified was solved if you hypothesized that mice do not in fact have long telomeres, that wild mice have short telomeres, and that it is laboratory mice that have long telomeres that have been elongated as a result of the breeding protocols that we use to produce laboratory mice. Now, the reason that the literature concluded that mice have long telomeres is that there were many tests that showed that, in fact, the telomeres were always long. But what was unclear was that they had all gotten their mice from the same place. And so the protocol that had changed, that had caused the evolution of long telomeres in mice, then became a pseudo-replication, meaning that many laboratories were sourcing their mice and coming up with the same answer, but not because it was representative of nature. Instead, it was representative of this particular source of mice. So to make a long story short, I put that hypothesis on the table. I shared it with somebody who had been studying telomeres, and she tested the hypothesis. She put a graduate student on the work. That graduate student tested the hypothesis that wild mice had short telomeres, and I got a very excited email reporting that, in fact, the hypothesis was true. Mice actually have short telomeres. So that's the good news. That meant, oh, my hypothesis about telomeres, senescence, and cancer is likely right because the one obstacle was now gone. But the problem is that had dire implications for medicine and, in particular, pharmacology, because when an animal, like a mouse, has very long telomeres, what that means is that it is extremely prone to cancer, which is true. Laboratory mice all die of cancer if you give them time. But they are also extremely resistant to tissue damage in a way that humans aren't, because they effectively have an infinite capacity to replace cells. So if a poison doesn't outright kill a mouse, the mouse will show far fewer pathologies than a human because it can replace its tissues in a way that a human cannot. Now, that piece of news should have caused a change in the way we studied drug safety. It should have caused us to reinvestigate every drug that had been tested on these broken mice, again, using mice that were not broken, to see if the drugs that we had released were in fact safe for humans in the way that we thought they were. Instead, this caused what appears to me, as an outsider, to be a massive cover-up in which we pretended that the mouse telomere issue was not a problem. We didn't go back and recheck any drugs. We never connected the dots with respect to Vioxx, Fen-Phen, Seldane, erythromycin, all of the drugs that had done heart damage when they were released into people, which we did not expect based on animal testing. So what I saw was a scientific system that stared down a major error that it had produced. Initially, I assumed that error was accidental, but instead of curing it, I believe what happened is the pharmaceutical industry realized that they had a mechanism for getting through safety testing with drugs that were poisonous, and that was good for business. And so they preserved it. And as far as I know, this problem persists to this day.
Well, that's we started off with a black pill, Bret.
Sorry about that.
And now I understand, because you talked about that with Joe Rogan, and now I understand in even greater detail that it wasn't just the oversight to begin with. It was perpetuating, basically approving drugs which might not otherwise get approval if you test them on the proper mice, which have a natural telomere length, whatever that gene thing.
It's even worse than that, because as bad as it is to have a system that is biased in the direction of making compounds look safe even when they're not, it is even worse that we have mice that are not representative of normal mammalian physiology. What that means is that as we do science on these animals, We are generating answers that are incorrect, and they just lodge themselves in the literature and they become foundational. And really, there should have been a massive investigation. That investigation should have caused a change in the way we sourced and bred these animals. And then we should have gone back and figured out all of the conclusions that would be rendered insecure as a result of these broken models. And we never did it. So we are figuratively blinding ourselves by using non-representative model animals. And when you say that to a scientist who uses these animals, you always get the same reply. We know the mice are broken. But it's very frustrating to me to hear that, because there is no reason the mice have to be broken in this way. There are ways that they will always be not terribly representative, but they are systematically misleading us here in a way that pollutes science. And so the upshot of this personally is, once you have seen science stare down an insight like this, you know that everything you were told about the way science is supposed to work is at least no longer true, right? Nobody's really interested in the truth. They're much more interested in knowing where the science is going to go so that they are well positioned for it. It's effectively like watching insider information used in trading, right? That is not the market correctly adjusting the price of things. That's people cheating.
Speaking of people who have sort of seen the collapse of science in the pharmacological industry, and that kind of changed their political trajectory. Today, Robert Kennedy Jr. announced his candidacy for the presidency. As you mentioned, your father worked for his father. What are your thoughts about his announcement and his campaign?
Well, I have two thoughts. I'm definitely a fan, and I know that will cause many people to clutch their pearls and, reach for fainting couches or whatever it is that people do these days, because he is supposed to be some kind of a whack job. But I actually know the man, and he's not a whack job. He's actually incredibly insightful and decent. And the idea that many of us have been lured into believing that he's something else is really evidence of the strength of the propaganda machine that has taken over mainstream media. So on the one hand, I'm very much in favor of this candidacy. Basically, I would like to see anybody who has integrity and intelligence and courage throw their hat in the ring so that we actually have some decent choices come election day. On the other hand, there is a part of me that's a little troubled that he's running inside of the Democratic Party, because I have, though I've been a Democrat since the first day that I could vote, I have completely lost any trust in this party. I basically look at it as like the family dog that has contracted rabies, right? That's not the family dog anymore. Whatever that thing is a lethal hazard and should be treated that way. That's what I see in the Democratic Party. So I'm glad he's running. I think he is an excellent candidate for the job, certainly far better than either of the mainstream offerings in the last election. But I'm concerned about the Democratic Party and anything that is pretending it's a legitimate entity at this point. It isn't.
I just interviewed Roger Stone on Monday, and he said, the idea of a unity ticket after RFK Jr. gets screwed the way Bernie Sanders got screwed, he won't turn around and endorse whoever screws him. He goes independent and maybe joins his VP ticket with Trump. Barnes, I don't know what you think about that.
I think that's extremely unlikely. I mean, Kennedy is at heart a Democrat. Father was a Democrat. Grandfather was a Democrat. It's too deeply in his blood and in his DNA. But I think his candidacy is very welcome. I mean, probably the best, what I would call the populist left candidate since his father in 1968. And the big question is, can he salvage a Democratic Party that is in institutional disarray and has been hijacked by an agenda that's often oppositional to its own working class voting base? Can he break through with African-American and Latino voters? I mean, his father ultimately did in 1968. The assumption was his dad would not be able to do that, and his dad ultimately did in California. I mean, he was. I did love, speaking of a bridge topic on that, one of the things he said today was maybe if they hadn't censored him for 18 years, he wouldn't feel the need to talk for the next 18 months on a campaign slogan. You've experienced the insanity and inanity of the censorship regime. Were you surprised by it when it came about? I mean, both in terms of what happened in the craziness at Evergreen, which ended up being a precursor and a foreshadowing of what was going to happen across university and academic and mainstream culture writ large, but also then experiencing it in the Twitter space, experiencing it on social media, experience it from previous allies who you just break a little bit from the institutional or gatekeeper narrative to steal from your brother. Then all of a sudden you're persona non grata and someone like Robert Kennedy to no longer listen to, no longer trust, no longer hear. What was that whole process like for you?
But Bret, before you answer, we're going to end on YouTube right now. For everyone watching on YouTube, come over to Rumble for the answer. The link is there. Come in 3, 2, 1, and we're on it.